Good evening. This is John Milburn for Laws 11057. This is week 2 in term 3, 2017. This is Introduction to Law, and we have a number of people online. Thank you very much for attending live. I certainly appreciate that. I'll just invite you to mute your microphone if you're not speaking. Please feel free to show your face on the camera. We always like to engage with people, but if you prefer not to, you can stop the video, and likewise you can mute the microphone. So the first assessment, the portfolio, is due on Thursday week. Week 3, I'm very keen to resolve that portfolio issue and have that assessment in nice and early. To be honest, the hardest part about that assessment really is the technology. And I want to ensure that everyone is on top of the technology quickly. There is, as you're probably aware, some background work that needs to be done, and part of that involves me providing some information through to Associate Professor Scott Beattie. So certainly in the case of one student, I do apologise that the mistake for your inability to access the material was my error, and I'm looking to rectify that quickly. If you are able to set up your CQU Law account and your portfolio, and you're having some success with it, please let us know through UCrew. It'd be nice for people to see that others are able to successfully deal with that issue. Likewise, if you're having problems, please let us know, and we can collectively try to assist you. Now, what I'm doing is I'm just muting a few microphones here. So just a general rule, if you're not speaking, I'll just invite you to mute the microphone. Now, that's not to encourage you to remain mute. We want you to engage, ask questions, provide comments, and provide information that you've come across. The same principle applies in UCrew. If you come across something that you think is of interest, or if you believe you can help someone, then please do so. And I encourage the collaboration that we talked about last week. All right, so are there any questions about the first assessment, the portfolio, and in particular, the CQUlaw.net account?
It's Michael here. Yeah,
Yes, Michael.
I have my CQ Law account, but I just can't access the portfolio. It just rejects me every time.
All right, and you've been trying the password ACE Attorney?
Well, I've gone through ACE Attorney and changed my password into my CQ Law account.
Oh, okay.
Done that already, but now I'm trying to get into the sites Google. It won't let me.
Right, okay. I'll make a note, and I'll just go look at my records to ensure that things like spelling of your name that I've taken that down correctly. The general rule is that your CQ Law account is your first name dot second name, or surname if you like, at CQUlaw.net. And I'm sure that's what you've done, Michael?
Yes, correct.
All right. So I'll make a note of that problem, and I'll see I'll work with you to see if we can resolve that. Are there any other students having difficulty?
John, that's the same issue that I was having.
Yes.
That day. I found that it was just the device I was using, which was my Samsung Galaxy tablet. When I moved over to my work laptop, I can access without any issues.
Okay. Now, yeah, thank you, Alison. I think you sent an email or a UCrew comment. If it was an email, I'd certainly invite you to put that on UCrew. That might assist. So you found that by using your tablet, you were unsuccessful, but going to a work laptop, it was fine. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, I could access through my CQ Law email, but when I click on sites, it would throw me back out to having to put my password in. But it's only on that one Samsung device I have that issue.
All right. Thank you. Does that assist, Michael? Does it give another idea?
It's not asking my password. It's just saying I don't access. I've screenshot it. I'm just going to have to email it to you, the screenshot, what it tells me. I can't put it on this conversation we have.
Are you able to? No, and better still, even if you could put it on UCrew,
Yes,
because others may be able to assist. And Nick, I see that Nicholas McIntosh is assisting people on UCrew. He was a student last term, came up with some great videos. If you are having difficulty, please make sure that you look at Nicholas's videos. I'm sure that you have looked at those as well, Michael.
I've been going through his one to set it up. I'm only halfway through it, but when I got to the sites, it just kicks me out straight away. As soon as I go to sites.
All right. Well, perhaps if I could just urge you and everyone to have a look at Nicholas's videos completely, and that may provide some hints because, to be honest, he's much better at this than I am. So I'm reasonable with the technical side, but I'm certainly not as good as others. But we'll try and work through it, Michael, so thank you. All right. Now, I know that there's some questions on the chat facility about the content of the portfolio, but before we go to the content, are there any further questions, comments, or problems regarding the technical side? All good? All right. Yes.
Sorry.
Jess?
I'm actually having a problem with getting into UCrew. I go onto it and it comes up with error message.
I might just come back to UCrew just on that. I'm just dealing with the cqulaw.net account at the moment, Jess. But
Okay.
I hadn't forgotten UCrew, and I will come back to that shortly.
Okay.
So if we just hold that for a sec. So there are no other questions about the cqulaw.net account technical side? All right. Before we go to you, yes, sorry, yes, Annie?
Yes, John, I tried to insert the picture on your profile, on the, I can't remember what is it called. Yeah, and I could not, by the time I insert my picture, it's just blow everything. That's what I have trouble. I have already got the account for CQ Law. That's the only picture I'm struggling to put it in.
All right. So your problem relates to the technical issues about pictures, and there were some discussions, as I recall, on UCrew about that. Who came up with a solution? It was very good. I'm just trying to think who that was. Have you looked on UCrew, Annie?
Yes, I did actually, and I thought was maybe I have to insert the page, which is Word document, and probably that's what I will do, but I haven't done it yet.
All right, but I know that there was some comment made to assist a student in terms of uploading a photograph, and it was to do with the sizing aspect of it. Yes, Diane?
It's Diane. I think Craig put that comment up this afternoon.
It was Craig, yes. Craig is here, isn't he? Craig?
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Do you want to assist us just run through that, Craig, what you said?
So you've got to crop the picture first, or make it a small picture. And then once you go into it, you select the picture, and then you get to choose small, medium, or large. And you only get really 3 choices from it.
Okay. Thanks for that, Craig.
I hope that helps, Annie. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Diane, for refreshing my memory. All right. Any other technical questions about the cqulaw.net account? We'll move on to the content of the portfolio, and then we'll deal with UCrew. So in terms of content, I know there's been some questions about ethos. And look, perhaps if I should indicate, there's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to this. What we're looking for is something that is honest and something that reflects where you have been and where you're going and how you philosophically approach the law. Now, we don't need to get too bogged down in these issues. There's I don't have a template that says this is the correct answer for ethos, and here's a list of things that are incorrect. It doesn't work like that because it's really a reflection of you. Certainly, I would suggest that if you're struggling for any comments about things like ethos, have a look at a legal dictionary. You can access legal dictionaries in the Law Library online. Have a look at your textbook that may assist. There are other textbooks around as well. There are some issues that might assist you in terms of commentary from, say, the bar practice course, or sorry, from the barrister's rules or the solicitor's conduct rules, which deal with issues to do with ethos as well. So you can look quite broadly at these issues, and you don't need to be constraining yourself in terms of those issues. and looks like we're maybe having some connection problems. So we'll just work through that, but hopefully you can continue to hear me and see me. Sorry about that, Marcus. All right, so I'm dropping in and out a bit, so I'll try and ensure that I speak as clearly as possible in those circumstances. So in terms of the content for the portfolio, you may have gathered that the Word document that I referred to in the assessment is really just a duplication of what you put online. It's just a different version of the same content. So there's nothing special about the Word document itself. And there's nothing special about the word limit. It's only indicative, meaning that it's a reflection of the amount of work that we expect you to put in the portfolio. So for this one, I'm not really concerned about word counts, but I would ask that you make your document as efficient as possible. I don't need a lot of detail. In many ways, the portfolio is a starting point to reflect your legal personality. It should be something like a CV with some special material contained within it. In a CV, you don't usually have artifacts, and a CV, you don't usually have a YouTube clip, but in the professional portfolio, you are able to give some indication of where you've been, where you hope to go, and you can justify or support your credentials by reference to the artifacts that you include and upload. Don't go, if I was to say anything, if you have more material, that's probably not as good as having less material. So generally less material for this assessment, the better. And it's not one where there's a right or wrong answer. And generally, if you overcome the technology, you just provide me with your portfolio, you'll normally do fairly well. So there's a question here about an example of a portfolio. There is an example online on the main Moodle screen. Now, there are a couple there, and you can probably find a few online as well. So Jessica's got a sample there. Just tell us about that one, Jessica.
This is the one that you had just on the main screen when you scroll down on the Moodle. I just printed it out.
Thank you. Great. And that's on the landing page for Moodle, as we call it, or as I call it anyway. So thank you, Jessica. And anyone else have any questions, comments? All good? Okay, so definitely not an assessment to stress about in terms of the content. Now, in terms of a YouTube clip, just a short is fine. You won't, I really don't want a 20-minute clip. I'm looking more for 2 minutes, 1 minute, just something to reflect your personality. Again, it's something which must draw the attention of the viewer and give some indication as to your personality and your background. Okay, so what I propose to do is just take you to the Moodle page, just quickly go through a few things to ensure that you are finding what I would hope that you can find. Let's see if I've selected the correct desktop. You should be seeing the Moodle landing page for Introduction to Law. Is that the one you've got on your screen? Great, thank you very much. So in terms of material for the first assessment and UCrew, which we will get to, you'll see as we scroll down the screen, under assessment guides, we have information relevant to the first assessment. And there we have the assessment material for assessment number 1, and that includes the template and the portfolio example, and includes a link to the case, Humsey Hancock, and academic misconduct procedures. That could be useful in terms of content for ethos. Above that, we have the LACC disclosure guidelines for applicants for admissions. That may give you some guidelines for ethos as well, if you're looking for some material. And below that, we have a rough outline for the second assessment, which you're probably not too worried about at the moment, but you know where it is from there. Each week, I will upload a copy of the video. Usually it will be either just a link, as it is here from the previous week, and there'll be a copy of that in lectures under each week. So for week 1, introduction, concepts, history. Last week's session is recorded and accessible here through the link in lectures. So you should, of course, read the material. You should undertake the problems. The problems are useful because that may give you some indication as to what might be in the examination. So thank you to Casey, Dion and Thomas for providing uploaded responses to the first questions. I expect to see everyone provide their uploaded responses to those questions, and the work that you do there will most likely assist you through the examination. If we go back to the page, you'll see that from time to time I provide news forums. That's really me just making announcements that come through by way of email. And each week there are other resources potentially for you to consider. For example, in week 3, some other PDFs and Word documents. All right, so does anyone have any questions, problems, comments in relation to the layout of Moodle except for UCrew, which I am coming to? Okay, so there's a question about the examination. If we go to the Moodle page again, I'll share the screen. You should see the Moodle page. Top left-hand side, assessment number 3. This is the examination. I shouldn't call it an examination. I've got to stop doing that. What I mean is the briefing paper, which is a take-home paper. And it's released at 4 o'clock on Thursday, the 8th of February, and it's due on Thursday, the 8th of February at 8 o'clock. So you have a 4-hour window. It's worth 40%. To be honest, it shouldn't take you more than an hour and a half or 2 hours to complete that task. So if you can't get online at 4 o'clock, don't stress. If you allow yourself 2 hours window, 2 hours to do the task during that 4-hour window, that's more than likely to be sufficient. But if you want to use the full 4 hours, then by all means, you're welcome to do that. So when I talk about the exam, I'm using imprecise language. I mean the briefing paper, the take-home paper, which you will sit on the 8th of February. Right, any questions then about the layout of Moodle and the assessment regime, leaving aside for a moment the issue of UCrew, which I will come back to.
John, it's Craig.
Yes, Craig.
With the problem, is that part of the assessment? Do we get feedback on our responses in the problems?
No, you don't. It's not part of any assessable work, and I probably won't give too much feedback, but I will monitor the answers, and if I see something that's incorrect, I'll very politely point out another way of looking at the problem, or I may give some comments about that was a good answer. But generally, I won't provide a model answer on those, and that gives you a bit of a hint as to why you would want to answer those questions carefully and properly. Question about how and where we upload those answers. I'll go back to sharing the screen, and thank you, Craig. Thank you, Jessica, for those questions. If we look at the screen again, and again, you should see the landing page. At the bottom of each week's work, you'll see under lectures, reading, further resources, you'll see problem. And if you click on that link to problems, you have an opportunity, if your screen is the same as mine, to add a new discussion topic. If you click that link, you will then come up with an opportunity to type your responses, and you can join the 3 who have already uploaded their response there. Now, do we have Casey, Dion, or Thomas online at the moment? No? Okay. Give that a go. And so, no, don't put it in general discussion or UCrew. That's where I've just showed you is where you upload those weekly problems. You've obviously got a chance to look at each other's and compare the work. If you like someone's answer and you happen to use that content in the examination, you'll need to reference their answer, because I'll be aware of the responses that were placed on UCrew, on the Moodle site, and if I know that someone has borrowed somebody else's idea, then I'll expect that you would have referenced that material in the same way that you would reference material from a textbook or a case or from legislation. Does that all make sense? So there's some advantage in being first, because people may be, advertising how good your work is by giving it credit in their own material, in their own paper. So the question about referencing, what do I mean by that? So referencing is basically going back to the source and saying, this is the source of my material. It might be that you're referencing page 234, for example, of the New Lawyer, or it might be that you're referencing paragraph 27 of a particular case or a section of legislation. So that's what we mean by referencing, and the collaboration aspect is that you're having an opportunity to look at each other's work and provide your own contribution so that there's a collective approach to answering these problems to hopefully come up with the best response. And the question is it credible to reference others' answers to the problems? That's a matter for you to assess. If you believe that the work presented by another student is to some degree novel and it's authoritative and it's good work, then if you borrow that material, then you should reference it. But what I'm really concerned about is people just simply taking somebody else's work and passing it off as their own. That we can't do. So if you like somebody else's work and you borrow a concept or you borrow the content, that's when you should reference it. As for whether or not you believe it's correct and accurate, that's a matter for you. I guess on that point, I would say, and I haven't forgotten you, crew, on that point, when you're referring to legal material, you should always go to the primary sources of the law as opposed to secondary sources. We'll talk more about that, but in short, primary sources of the law are legislation and cases. Secondary sources of the law are books, websites, articles, reference material, the work of fellow students. Where possible, cite me the primary sources, legislation and cases. All right, so are we all clear then on what's available to you on Moodle, where you find your assessment, how you upload your assessment, where you find the weekly problems, where you find the weekly Zoom sessions that are recorded? Are we all good with all of those things? Or are there any technical issues? Excellent, all right. I feel like we're making good progress. Thank you very much. Let's go back and have a look at UCrew. I'll share the screen. And you should see the Moodle page. Let's go back to the main problem. The main landing page, as I call it. Under latest information, we have a number of links to the timetable. You'll recall last week I had the timetable replicated in full under latest information. I've taken that out now to save space, but you can access the timetable in that Word document. We have the assessments, links to the Facebook group, and then we have UCrew class discussion. I was only able to finalise these today. There were some issues with UCrew, and I spoke to the technical staff today, and we resolved those issues. So there are two ways to access UCrew. This is one way through Moodle, which is now available to you. If you click on this link, UCrew class discussion, it will take you through to the UCrew page for this subject, Introduction to Law, and you'll be able to follow the thread of discussions. If you have a question, here's where you ask the question. If you come across a website, good information, a guide that might help, or you have a problem, then that's where we include the material. You'll see that we help each other, as Talai has done in the case of Hayley. if there are problems, ask through here, as Casey has. And I'm on to your problem, Casey. If you've got some good success, then update the material here. So thank you, Craig, for responding to Annie's question and so on. So is everyone familiar then with uCrew and familiar with how to access uCrew? All good? Now, who had a question about uCrew? Was it, who was that? Oh, Jess, was it? Did you have a question, Jess? Just unmute you. Yes.
Yeah, I just asked because I was getting that error message. I couldn't actually get into uCrew, but I'm trying to do it now after you've just said that. We can't hear you.
John, we cannot hear you, John.
Sorry, can you hear me now? All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So Jess, there are two ways to access uCrew: through the landing page, which has only been properly established today after I spoke to the technical staff, given the changes that were happening on uCrew, and also through the My CQU page, which is, if you like, your main page. But Jess, if you have problems, just send an email to uCrew support, or put a link on uCrew. And I'm sorry, well, obviously you can't get to uCrew. Send me an email and we'll try and follow that through. All right,
yeah, so, I think I've just accessed it now, so it's okay.
Oh, you're through? Good. All
yeah.
right, great.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so what we've talked about tonight so far is the first assessment, which is due on Thursday week. We've talked about the Moodle page, the way you navigate around, and what I'd like to do is now start talking more about the substance of the course rather than some of the mechanical sides of the course. Always reluctant to start that until I feel comfortable that almost everybody is sorted as far as the technical side. I've got a note here, we've got to sort out Casey with the CQ. And Michael, are you still having problems with yours?
I've just played with it. The thing I can see is that I don't get the option of accepting terms and conditions when I go to the Google's portfolio. There's no accept button.
Okay.
I've just worked that. I've spent 20 minutes then playing with it.
Yeah, thank you. So if there's still problems, please let us know, and we'll see if we can work through that together.
Yeah, I sent you a screenshot on email.
Oh, okay. All right. Thank you. And also, I'd urge everyone to have a look at Nicholas's videos, because I know that he had a troubleshooting section, and there may be some answers in there to assist. When it comes to your portfolio, I've mentioned tonight the value of brevity in your language. Simplicity in writing and speaking in law is the preferred option. Gone are the days where lawyers are pompous in their language and their approach. When I started law in the 70s, documents such as leases and mortgages were very poorly drafted. Long, convoluted sentences that tried to cover a great deal of material but failed to communicate in a clear manner. I call that gobbledygook. Another way of describing it is legalese. So here's something that I wrote in my attempt to show you what writing was like in the 70s in law. You'll see that it's very long sentences, quite often written in the passive voice. Many instances where people use a number of examples to highlight a point. For example, here, you'll be encouraged to and required to transfer your thoughts, views, opinions, judgments, points of views and deliberation hereinafter referred to as projections in a holistic sense. And that was very typical of the way in which we would draft things. We'd try to list every possible thing in a paragraph or a sentence. And you'll see again further down in the commentary, the communication paradigms, examples, models, standards, prototypes, and templates. That's the sort of thing we used to do. Hereinafter is an example of what we call legalese. So that type of word that you simply wouldn't use in practice is now something that we attempt to avoid when communicating in law. And when you look at that sentence, despite the fact that I have said that you will be encouraged to become super efficient with your verbal and written projections, it really doesn't tell us very much, does it? What it really says is that while you're studying at CQU and you're studying law, communicate simply and effectively. So why not say communicate simply and effectively rather than have all the jargon and legalese that's contained in that document? I mean, maybe that's a poor example, but it just gives you an idea of what I'm trying to describe when I talk about simplicity, brevity. And it is very often more difficult to write something in a brief, understandable manner, in a plain English manner, than it is to use legalese. The law is something that is created in a number of ways. So can anyone tell me how many limbs, if you like, are there in the separation of powers?
3.
3? Okay. So Parliament creates the laws. The executive deals with the execution of those laws, and the courts interpret the laws. And it's fluid, it's changing, and it's open to interpretation. So Parliament makes laws. Parties and lawyers disagree about how those laws are applied to the facts of a particular case. The matter goes to a court, and the court makes a determination. In the course of interpreting the laws, the judges themselves may disagree. And you'll see a judge makes a decision at first instance, which is then subject to an appeal and perhaps overruled on appeal. Also, you'll find that there are split decisions. So it may be, for example, that 2 out of 3 judges decide a matter in a particular way, and the third is in the dissent. So the point that I'm making is that even highly trained, well-educated, and experienced lawyers will disagree about how the law should be interpreted or how the law should be applied in a particular circumstance. That means it's open for you to argue a certain way, and even though it may be that I disagree completely with what you're saying, allow me to give you a 100% mark for being correct. Because I won't necessarily say that is the legal position. If you mount a good argument, despite the fact that it's not what I believe to be correct, I'll respect that argument and reward you accordingly. Now, of course, you might be dead wrong. You may say something which is clearly not the case in a statute. So just be aware of, you can't have carte blanche, but if you interpret a statute, if you go to the correct source of the law and you argue for its interpretation in a certain way, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're wrong. The way that I talk about it being fluid is, of course, that the courts will interpret laws, the community might react. Community outrage at judges' decision, judges losing touch with reality, have no sense of what the community expects in terms of things. Parliament then comes back in, creates a new law, and that overrules, that reverses the effect of the judge's decision for future matters coming before it. So it in some way is circular, it's fluid, it keeps moving around. On the other hand, sometimes the Parliament goes too far And the media described the laws as draconian laws, these harsh draconian laws. And you will find the reverse situation where, in response to the community expectations about harsher penalties, the Parliament will create mandatory sentences, irrespective of the circumstances of the case. Someone must go to jail, and they must go to jail for 3 years. Then you'll find the exception where a judge sends someone to jail for 3 years in circumstances where clearly that's unfair, and the media will then approach the situation from the opposite view and talk about the draconian laws that are too tough. So just be aware of some of those issues. Now, because the law is constantly changing, and because there's not necessarily a right or a wrong answer, you need to be wary of a simplistic answer. Sometimes you may look at a set of circumstances and say, that's what it is, and look at it in terms of black and white. But there are distinctions. There are distinctions between different branches of the law. It might be contract law, or it might be torts law, it might be consumer law, it might even be constitutional law. So if you look at the same problem from different branches of the law, you may come up with a different response. And likewise, if you consider the legal problem from the perspective of the law or equity, you may come up with a different response. And you're probably thinking now, what do you mean the law and equity? What's all that about? Well, we'll talk about that shortly. But essentially, historically, the law came from two branches. If we go back, most of our law comes from England. And if we go back a few centuries, there was Parliament-made law, but it was minor, relatively minor, compared to the judge-made law. And some of the judge-made law was strict black-letter law. So if you hear about black-letter law, it means that a judge is taking a very strict, simplistic approach to the legal problem and coming up with a response. That was one branch. The other branch was equity. And by the name equity, it implies fairness, where the judge in the equitable jurisdiction would not apply the black letter law, but come up with a result that is fair in all the circumstances. So people could either have their matter determined at law, which is the legal courts, or by equity through the equitable jurisdiction, the equitable courts, such as Chancery. And it was really only in the late 19th century, through the Judicature Act, which I think was 1873, that there was a merger of those two. But even now, you will find that there's a difference between law and equity, even though they're both part of the legal position. So law is used in two senses in that regard. And you'll sometimes come across it when you're looking at remedies. So for example, if you're advising a client in relation to a contract for the sale of land, you're acting for the buyer, and the seller refuses to settle and convey that property for no good reason. At law, you might, as a buyer, be entitled to damages. At equity, you might be entitled to an order forcing the seller to transfer the land to you. In other words, to follow through with the contract. We call that specific performance. So as you're doing your reading, just be aware of the historical context, because it does reflect sometimes in the language, and it sometimes reflects in the remedies. So equity is involved in remedies. Thank you, Michael, for that, and that's right. So think about the remedy, and that's where you may have some issue with law and equity in that historical sense. So where do we look to find the law? Who can tell me the two main areas of law, sources of our law? We talked about it earlier tonight, and I said, if you're going to quote something to me, yes?
Common law and legislation.
Yes, that common law, which is the court's law, cases, and legislation, those two form part of the what source of law, as opposed to reference books, texts.
The primary source.
Exactly, primary and secondary. So if you hear me talking about primary source of law, or if I critique an answer and I say, no, quote me the primary source, what am I really saying? I'm saying, don't tell me that the new lawyer says on page 27 that the Australian consumer law applies in these circumstances. Don't tell me that. Tell me about the primary source of law. Tell me what the Australian consumer law says. Even though, and this is where it gets a bit tricky, even though you may have got the idea that the Australian consumer law applies by reading it in the new lawyer, I want you to quote the Australian consumer law. That's not against the rules to do that, because the primary source of law is available to all of us. No particular author of a textbook, study guide, or other material can claim ownership over a primary source of law. That's open for all of us. So you might read about it in the study guide, but if it's a case or section, don't quote the study guide, quote me the case, quote me the legislation, quote me the primary source. Does that make sense? All good? Good. All right. Brief digression. I'm going to give you a list of some movies, and I want you to tell me what these are like, because you may have some better ones. Some legal movies. Can you see that? There's 12 there.
Yes.
12. You can see those? All right. Has anyone seen some or all of those? Has anyone got others that they'd recommend? What I'm really looking about, what I want you to do as part of your homework is to find a really good movie about the law, one that will help to inspire you and educate you. Some of these movies are really very good. I mean, My Cousin Vinny, for example, is a great movie when it comes to looking at issues to do with advocacy and evidence. I mean, it's entertaining. I think it's a brilliant movie. To Kill a Mockingbird, that's probably on everybody's list of movies. Philadelphia, of course. So these are just some of the ones that you might like to select. But I'd like you to spend an hour and a half or 2 hours looking at a good movie about the law. If you find one, if you recommend one, please mention it on UCrew, because I want people to start thinking about law in the wider context as well. I'll add this list to UCrew, and you can then add your own from there. So let's go back to talking about the primary sources and the secondary sources. So given that legislation is a primary source of law, you need to work out a way to find legislation. Double jeopardy, the castle, the firm. We're getting some good ones coming through. All right, so legislation. Has anyone been able to find legislation online somewhere? And if so, where?
Yeah, I use it for work through Ostly.
Ostly, yes.
Yeah.
Great. Ostly's terrific. Do you like the new beta version of Ostly?
We're just getting that uploaded at the moment. We're just getting training around that.
Right, yes. So the look of Ostly, for those of you who used it in the past, changed a few months ago, and I think the new version is terrific. Through the CQ library, says Diane. Yep. You can access legislation directly from the internet. Now, Ostly is AUSTLII. It's the Australian Legal Institute Clearinghouse. I've forgotten the exact acronym, but Ostly is AUSTLII. Google that. Also, from a Queensland point of view, look up, just Google Queensland legislation. That will take you through to the Queensland website. It has the same content as AUSTLE. The Queensland website material is what we call the authorised material. AUSTLE is not authorised, but it is still very authoritative and very valuable. We're going to spend a few weeks on legal research. You're going to know AUSTLE and Queensland legislation very well. From a federal jurisdiction, okay, so Deb reads the ATO legislation, which is federal, of course. So Deb, where do you access your federal legislation?
I actually belong to a Treasury committee, so I read and belong directly with the Treasury.
It's direct link through there, but
yes,
does it go through to the legislation register? To the
yes, it does.
Right. Okay. So have a look, and even on UCRU, Deb, if you'd like to give us a link to the federal legislation, Google that. You'll find it easily, but try and find the authoritative version. We'll talk more about these, but I just want to get you started. So your homework generally this week, find a movie, inspire yourself, and find at least how to find Queensland or your relevant state legislation and Commonwealth legislation. And just read, just get an idea, get a feel for it, so that you're ahead of the game before we talk about that in more detail. Now, what about cases? You can go to AUSTLE, we'll give you some good material on cases. Barnett Jade is very good for cases as well, or Jade Barnett, B-A-R-N-E-T, J-A-D-E, Jade Barnett is good. So just try and find some material. Has anyone looked through the CQU library yet? Has anyone been online and looked at the library? Yes, Hayley has. Yes. How did you find that, Hayley?
Yeah, it was fantastic. It was actually really easy to navigate my way through, so I was really impressed with it.
Great. Okay. So if you do find your way to the library, this is just a little brief snippet of what we're going to be dealing with shortly. You'll find something like this. And that's the Law Resource Guide. I think someone created a link to this on UCRU, but maybe that was a different subject. But have a look at that. So the guides.library.cqu.edu.au, you should be able to find that pretty readily. And the Law Resources Guide, there's a link to AUSTLE, but you can find that directly through the internet. And if you're looking through this list, I would recommend that you look at Westlaw and Lexis Advanced Pacific, which is the new platform replacing LexisNexis AU. So the one at the bottom, Westlaw, have a look at Lexis Advanced Pacific and have a look at AUSTLE to get you started. If you want a fourth, have a look at CCH. Over on the left-hand side, they're the law databases. On the left-hand side, you'll find reference to law dictionaries and encyclopedias. These are an excellent way of quickly ascertaining legal content. I would recommend Halsbury's and the Laws of Australia on that list. If you want a third one, look at the Encyclopedic Australian Legal Dictionary. If you feel inclined, go beyond that, but by next week or the week after, I'd like to ensure that everyone has at least had a quick look at those things, because we'll be talking about them in depth, and I want to see that people have at least got some idea of what it looks like. So we're happy to do, we've got some idea of the homework, and what I'd like you to do is share some of your ideas on UCRU. If you find something is great, not so great, let us know about it. If you come up with some ideas, tips, you've worked away and you've found a way to solve things easily, then let us know that. Okay, you should have all read through the first 2 chapters of your textbook by now. When you read textbooks and legal information, I'm interested to get an idea of how you do that. Does anyone have a particular technique? Do you, for example, when you open a textbook like The New Lawyer, do you just go to the first page and just start reading? Do you look at the headings and the chapters? Do you speed read and gloss over and then go back and read it again in detail? I mean, how do people do this? Has anyone got any particular suggestions? Yes,
Hi,
Craig.
John. How I read it?
Fine, thanks. Might just hear from Craig first, and then we'll hear from you, Annie, if that's okay. Yes, Craig.
So yeah, I speed read, and then I go back, and then as I'm reading, I type points of interest down on a piece, like as I'm in a word processor.
Okay, great. Thank you. Annie, how do you go about it?
Yes, maybe this is not really good idea what I'm using. I normally go with the question first, then try to find the answer straight away with the contents and glossaries.
All right. I like that approach. That's a brave approach. So that's an aggressive approach. That's good. I like that approach. All right. Some other comments coming through. Jenna gloss reads first and then does revision work and rereads as needed. Thomas starts at the starts and reads through and makes notes, leaving highlights. Marcus speed reads the night before, sleep on the content, allowed subconscious observation, and then carefully reread the following day. I like that tip as well. This is the way I do it. If I was reading a textbook like The New Lawyer, I would go to the chapters first. Now, that part of that is, before I start to read the text, I look at the chapters. Now, part of that is because of the way in which I read legislation. When I read legislation, I'll look at the chapters and the headings first, look at all of those things without reading any of the content, just to get a feel for where this legislation is going, so I can put things in context. I mean, for example, if you look at The New Lawyer, what you'll see is, before you start to read the text, that it's actually divided into 3 parts. And the authors have really conveniently put this on one page. So they said, okay, if you want to get an overall view of this text, be aware that we've written in this style. Part 1, the first 5 chapters, deals with knowing the law. Part 2, chapters 6 to 10 inclusive, deals with doing the law, applying the law. And part 3, which is chapters 11 to 14 inclusive, is being a lawyer. I like that approach, and I'd commend that to you, so that when you read a text, I would read the headings carefully. Practice doing that, because you must do that when you're reading legislation. Beyond that, there's a few personal approaches. I must say, I'm taken by Michelle's approach, and I'm taken by Annie's approach too. But there's some really good ideas there. So feel free to share those ideas in UCrew. The good thing about the chat facility is that they're there on the night and I can see them, but they're kind of lost. Whereas UCrew, you've got a more permanent idea, and I think there's some really good approaches to be done. I tend to use the yellow highlighter. I don't know why yellow, but I just always have. But when I do highlight, I ensure that I can read the highlighted section as a standalone part. So I would discourage you from highlighting random words, and to highlight in a manner that will allow you, on refreshing, to simply read the yellow parts and say, I've got it. That in itself makes sense to me. Other than that, I do make some notes, either on the text. So I'm not afraid to scribble on texts. Some people don't like to do that. I guess maybe they want to resell. Others say, well, I just don't like to dirty the book, but I like to use them. Using notes separately is a good idea. You probably know that I use voice recognition. So sometimes if I'm reading a case or a textbook, I will have the voice recognition running, so that as I'm reading the material, I'm actually saying words. As a thought comes to me based on what I've read, I'm saying it. there's a dual advantage to that. The first thing is, as I'm saying it, I'm still reading the book and I'm looking at other material, and it's being recorded in Word version for me. The other thing is that if you're like me, you'll learn better if you read it and hear it. Even if it's your own voice, the fact that you're saying it helps to reinforce the content. So that's another study guide, an idea that you might think about. When you read the material, you'll see that the authors talk about the threshold learning outcomes. Keep that in mind because there are 6 threshold learning outcomes here. They are, number 1, knowledge. Number 2, ethics and professional responsibilities. Number 3, thinking skills. Number 4, research skills. Number 5, communication and collaboration. And number 6, self-management. Now, when I went to law school, it was all about number 1, knowledge. That was pretty much it. There was no formal lectures or teaching in relation to ethics and professional responsibility. There was really not much in terms of thinking skills. There was a bit on legal research, but not much. There was nothing on communication or collaboration. There was nothing on self-management. Now, the fact that the authors have identified those 6 items as threshold learning outcomes, and I endorse that, means that we're going to treat them equally. What that means is that while we're learning law at this university, particularly with me, things like self-management will be given as much weight as will knowledge. Your ability to research will be given as much weight as your ability to develop thinking skills. And your ability to collaborate, communicate is just as important as knowing about your ethics and professional responsibilities. But you've got to know all 6 of them in order to truly be a good student of law and a good practitioner. So look at those threshold learning outcomes carefully. Think about how you can apply them in practice, and be aware, here's an exam tip, that, I'm sorry, I'm not allowed to say exam. In the briefing paper, I will expect that you'll be able to refer to and add contribution from each of those 6 threshold learning outcomes. Okay, and that might be a time for us to finish for tonight. Before we do, are there any closing comments, questions?
Yes, John, I just need to find out about the constitutional system.
Struggling with the constitutional system?
Yes, please.
So the Constitution that we often hear about, where did that come from? Who's responsible for the Constitution? Any ideas? Parliament, says Jessica, with a question mark, so it's sort of half answer. Yeah, any other thoughts? Government. Government is really the executive.
Isn't it the Westminster adoption?
Yeah, the Westminster adoption. So it all comes from the Crown. That's another idea. So the Constitution came about as a piece of imperial legislation that essentially gave legal birth to Australia. And the Constitution is really a piece of legislation to which we are bound, but bound by special rules in that in order to change the Constitution, we need to have a vote as opposed to Parliament being able to just change it. So, for example, with same-sex marriage, if Parliament wanted to do so, it could change the law easily. It just amends the Marriage Act. But if Parliament wanted to change the basis upon which politicians would be entitled to stand for office, that would require a change to the Constitution, which means we must vote on it. So the Constitution is legislation, but it is a very special type of legislation. And when we talk about the Constitution, we're usually talking about the Commonwealth Constitution. We do have a Queensland, but really it's the Commonwealth Constitution that's really important. That's, if you like, paramount. From that, we have Parliament is created, the courts are created, there is power to make delegated legislation. So have a look at the Constitution, have a look at the headings of the Constitution, Commonwealth, have a look at Section 51, have a look at Section 92. There are a couple of important sections. And just get a feel for it. From there, Annie, it flows down. And generally speaking, anything that's done by the Commonwealth overrides that which is done by the state. And anything that is done by Parliament, whether Commonwealth or state, takes precedent over judge-made law. So that's kind of a really flying summary of the hierarchy and constitutional democracy. I hope that answers in some very brief way, Annie, your question.
Yes, thank you very much, John.
Okay.
Now with the, sorry about that, I asked a lot of questions. With the Section 51, you mean only legislation for federal or common law? Which?
Section 51 of the Federal Constitution, of the Commonwealth Constitution. Yep. Just have a look at that and have a look at Section 92. Just give you a feel for how it all works.
Thank you so much, John.
Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much. You've all been very patient. Keep at the technology. Michael, a few others will try and sort things out. I'll list my 12 movies on uCrew. Please add to that and add comments in terms of how you access the law and other information that will help each other. Okay. All the best. See you next week. Bye.